The morning mist clung to the rocky shores of Gibraltar on April 30th, 711 BCE, as Tariq ibn Ziyad's fleet of ships materialized from the North African dawn. The Berber commander who stood at the prow of the lead vessel could not have imagined that his crossing of the narrow strait would unleash 8 centuries of warfare that would reshape the face of Europe and echo through the corridors of history until the end of time. Behind him sailed 7,000 warriors, a modest force by the standards of the great Islamic conquests, yet sufficient to topple a kingdom and plant the crescent banner from the Pyrenees to the Atlantic. The Iberian Peninsula that awaited Tariq's invasion was already fractured beyond repair. The Visigothic kingdom, heir to Roman authority in Hispania, had been consuming itself through decades of civil war, succession crises, and noble treachery. King Roderick, who would become the last Gothic ruler of Spain, held his throne through force rather than legitimacy, having usurped power from the rightful heir just 2 years earlier. His kingdom was a hollow shell, maintained through the brittle alliances of a warrior aristocracy that had forgotten the arts of governance in their pursuit of personal advantage. Yet even in its decay, Visigothic Spain represented something profound to the Christian consciousness of the 8th century. Here was the westernmost bastion of Christendom, the final frontier where the cross held dominion over territories that stretched back to the age of the apostles. The great Cathedral of Toledo housed relics that connected the faithful to the earliest days of the Church, while monasteries throughout the kingdom preserved the intellectual heritage of classical antiquity and patristic wisdom. When Tariq's warriors stepped onto Spanish soil, they were not merely conquering another territory. They were severing a link in the chain of Christian civilization that had bound together the Mediterranean world for 7 centuries. The battle that chroniclers would later call the defeat of Roderick unfolded along the banks of the Guadalete River in the summer of 711 with a swiftness that stunned both victor and vanquished. Roderick had assembled what remained of the Gothic army, perhaps 25,000 men drawn from across his fractured kingdom. Yet this impressive force proved tragically inadequate against Tariq's smaller, but infinitely more disciplined invasion army. The Berber and Arab warriors who crossed from Africa brought with them not merely superior tactics and equipment, but the fierce confidence of a religious movement that had conquered half the known world in less than a century. The Gothic army that faced them represented the end of an era. These were the descendants of the barbarian tribes who had carved kingdoms from the corpse of the Western Roman Empire. Yet they had grown soft in their Iberian paradise, more familiar with palace intrigue than battlefield discipline. When the two forces met along the muddy banks of the Guadalete, the contrast was immediately apparent. Tariq's warriors fought with the precision of professional soldiers guided by religious fervor, while Roderick's nobles seemed more concerned with preserving their own positions than achieving victory for their king. The collapse, when it came, was total and irreversible. Roderick himself vanished in the chaos of defeat. Some claimed he drowned while crossing the river in flight, others that he was cut down fighting to the last. His body never recovered from the field. His magnificent warhorse was found wandering riderless near the battlefield, its golden harness and jeweled saddle the only tangible proof that the kingdom of the Visigoths had indeed existed and had indeed fallen in a single afternoon of desperate combat. With Roderick's death, organized resistance to the Islamic invasion effectively ceased. City after city opened its gates to Tariq's advancing columns, their governors calculating that submission offered better terms than siege and storm. Toledo, the ancient capital, surrendered without a fight when its archbishop fled northward with whatever treasures and relics could be carried. Córdoba welcomed the Muslim armies as deliverers from Gothic oppression. Even Seville, that proud center of classical learning, chose negotiation over resistance when Tariq's banners appeared on the horizon. Yet even as the crescent moon rose triumphant over the great cities of Al-Andalus, as the conquered territory would be known to its new masters, something stirred in the remote valleys of the Asturian mountains that would prove more dangerous to Islamic rule than all the armies of Roderick combined. Among the ragged survivors who had fled northward from the Great Defeat, there gathered around a minor Gothic noble named Pelagius, the seed of what would become the longest and most consequential military campaign in European history. Pelagius was, by any objective measure, an unlikely founder of kingdoms. A younger son of a minor ducal family, he had fled the chaos of the Guadalete with perhaps 300 followers, knights, soldiers, and refugees who refused to accept the reality of conquest. The cave of Covadonga, where they made their desperate stand in 718, seemed more likely to become their tomb than the birthplace of Christian resistance. Yet when Munuza, the Muslim governor of the northern territories, dispatched a force to eliminate this troublesome remnant, something extraordinary occurred that would be remembered and celebrated for 8 centuries. The Battle of Covadonga, as it came to be known, was less a military engagement than a statement of defiant faith. Pelagius and his followers, vastly outnumbered and trapped in their mountain refuge, chose to fight rather than surrender. The chroniclers of later centuries would embellish the encounter with miraculous interventions. Arrows that turned back upon their shooters, divine voices heard above the clash of arms. Yet the bare facts were miraculous enough. Against overwhelming odds, the Christian remnant held their ground and inflicted such casualties upon their attackers that the Muslim force withdrew, leaving the northern mountains unconquered. More importantly, Covadonga established the essential myth that would sustain Christian resistance for the next 8 centuries. Here was proof that the conquest was not the will of God, that Christian arms could still prevail against the followers of Muhammad, that the loss of Spain was not the end of the story, but merely its beginning. Pelagius proclaimed himself king of the Asturians and began the patient work of building a Christian kingdom in the shadow of Islamic power. But his true achievement was creating the idea that would outlive him and his dynasty, the idea of Reconquista. The kingdom that emerged from the caves of Covadonga bore little resemblance to the sophisticated administrative structures of Visigothic Spain or the advanced civilization developing in Al-Andalus. The Asturian monarchy was, of necessity, a rough and ready institution built around the immediate requirements of survival and warfare. Its capital at Cangas de Onís was less a city than an armed camp, its court more reminiscent of a barbarian warband than a proper royal establishment. Yet these apparent weaknesses proved, paradoxically, to be sources of strength in the long struggle that lay ahead. The Asturian nobility that gathered around Pelagius and his successors shared none of the decadent sophistication that had doomed the Gothic aristocracy at Guadalete. These were men who had lost everything, lands, titles, treasures, save their swords and their faith. They had no choice but to fight, no alternative to victory, No future except the one they could carve from the bodies of their enemies. The harsh landscape of the northern mountains, seemingly unsuitable for kingdom building, became their greatest ally, providing natural fortresses that could be held by small forces against vastly superior numbers. More crucially, the early Asturian kings understood that their survival depended not upon conventional military strength, but upon their ability to embody the hopes and fears of the scattered Christian populations that remained under Islamic rule. They positioned themselves not merely as territorial lords, but as the rightful heirs to the Visigothic crown, the legitimate rulers of all Spain temporarily driven from their inheritance by infidel conquest. This claim, however legally dubious, provided a powerful organizing principle that could unite diverse populations around a common cause. The development of what historians would later call the Asturian Chronicle reveals the sophisticated propaganda campaign that accompanied the kingdom's military expansion. These carefully crafted narratives presented the struggle against Islamic rule not as a territorial dispute between rival powers, but as an apocalyptic conflict between the forces of light and darkness. A holy war whose outcome would determine the fate of Christian civilization in the West. Alfonso I, who succeeded Pelagius in 739, was presented not merely as a successful war leader, but as an instrument of divine justice, chosen by God to begin the liberation of Spain from infidel occupation. The character of the Reconquista was fundamentally altered by the intervention of Charlemagne in the late 8th century. The great Frankish emperor, architect of the revived Western Empire and patron of the Carolingian Renaissance, recognized that the Islamic presence in Iberia represented both a threat to his southern borders and an opportunity to extend Christian authority into territories that had been lost to the faith. His expedition across the Pyrenees in 778, though ultimately unsuccessful in its immediate objectives, established the crucial principle that the struggle for Spain was not merely a local conflict, but a pan-European crusade that deserved support from all Christian powers. The famous disaster at Roncesvalles, where Charlemagne's rearguard was ambushed and destroyed while retreating from an unsuccessful siege of Zaragoza, became through the genius of later poets a foundational myth of Christian knighthood. The Song of Roland, composed centuries after the event, transformed a tactical defeat into a moral victory, presenting the death of Charlemagne's nephew and his companions as a sacrifice that inspired future generations of Christian warriors. More immediately, the Carolingian intervention established the Spanish March, a buffer zone of fortified settlements that would become the nucleus of Catalonian resistance to Islamic expansion. The implications of Charlemagne's Spanish expedition extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. By positioning the struggle against Al-Andalus as a legitimate concern of the broader Christian community, the Frankish emperor elevated what had been essentially a regional conflict into a theater of the great civilizational struggle between Christianity and Islam. Future generations of European nobility would look to Spain not merely as a distant frontier, but as a proving ground where young knights could win their spurs in service to the faith and gain the indulgences promised to those who fought against the enemies of Christ. Perhaps most importantly, the Carolingian example demonstrated that successful resistance to Islamic power required more than local determination and mountain fortresses. It demanded the systematic application of resources, the coordination of multiple military efforts, and above all, the development of administrative and logistical capabilities that could sustain prolonged warfare across vast territories. The lessons learned from Charlemagne's Spanish adventure would guide Christian strategy for centuries to come. The 9th and 10th centuries witnessed the gradual transformation of Christian resistance from desperate survival into systematic reconquest. Alfonso II of Asturias, who reigned from 791 to 842, exemplified this evolution from refugee king to confident monarch. His establishment of a new capital at Oviedo, complete with palace, churches, and royal tombs, announced that the Christian monarchy was no longer merely camping in the mountains, but had come to stay. The discovery of the supposed tomb of Santiago, St. James, at Compostela during his reign provided the Christian cause with a powerful patron saint and pilgrimage destination that would attract support from across Europe. The military successes of Alfonso II and his successors reflected not merely individual courage, but the development of increasingly sophisticated strategies for warfare against Islamic forces. The early Asturian armies had been little more than armed bands, capable of raids and ambushes, but unable to sustain prolonged campaigns or siege warfare. By the 10th century, Christian forces had evolved into professional military organizations capable of coordinating complex operations across multiple theaters, maintaining supply lines through hostile territory, and conducting the systematic conquest and fortification of strategic positions. The expansion southward from the Asturian heartland followed the river valleys that provided natural corridors through the mountainous terrain of northern Spain. The conquest of Leon in 856 marked a crucial milestone, providing the Christian kingdom with a major urban center capable of supporting a royal court and serving as a base for further expansion. The capture of Burgos in 884 established Christian control over the vital Ebro River Valley and opened the path toward the rich agricultural lands of the Duero Basin. Yet perhaps the most significant development of this period was the emergence of what would become the defining characteristics of Reconquista warfare: the integration of military conquest with systematic colonization, the establishment of fueros, local charters, that attracted settlers to newly conquered territories, and the creation of military orders that combined monastic discipline with knightly warfare. These innovations transformed the Christian kingdoms from mere military expeditions into genuine state-building enterprises capable of permanent territorial expansion. The society that emerged in the expanding Christian kingdoms of northern Spain bore the indelible mark of 8 centuries of warfare. Yet it was far more complex than a simple military machine devoted to religious conquest. The constant pressure of frontier warfare created a unique social dynamic that blended aristocratic leadership with democratic participation, feudal hierarchy with frontier egalitarianism, religious devotion with pragmatic accommodation. The result was a civilization unlike anything elsewhere in medieval Europe. Harder, more mobile, more willing to embrace risk and innovation in pursuit of military and political advantage. The nobility that led the Reconquista developed distinctive characteristics that set them apart from their counterparts in more settled regions of Europe. These were not hereditary aristocrats secure in ancient landholdings, but military entrepreneurs whose status depended upon their ability to lead successful campaigns and attract followers to their banners. Wealth came not from agricultural rents, but from the spoils of war, the ransoms of captured enemies, and the tribute extracted from conquered territories. Social advancement depended not upon birth, but upon demonstrated courage, strategic intelligence, and the capacity to inspire loyalty among hardened warriors. The religious character of the struggle profoundly shaped the cultural development of Christian Spain, yet in ways that were often more complex than simple crusading fervor. The constant contact with Islamic civilization, even through warfare, exposed Christian intellectuals to sophisticated philosophical and scientific traditions that enriched their own scholarly pursuits. The great libraries of Toledo and Córdoba, when they eventually fell to Christian armies, provided access to classical texts that had been lost elsewhere in Europe, launching a renaissance of learning that would influence the entire continent. The phenomenon of convivencia, the coexistence of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish populations under Christian rule, revealed the practical limits of religious warfare. Successful Christian commanders quickly learned that wholesale slaughter or expulsion of conquered populations was economically counterproductive and militarily dangerous. The wealth of Al-Andalus had been built upon the agricultural and commercial expertise of diverse religious communities, and Christian rulers who hoped to benefit from their conquests needed to preserve these productive relationships even while asserting political dominance. As Christian power expanded and consolidated in the north, the unity that had characterized the early Asturian resistance began to fragment under the pressures of success. The original kingdom divided into separate realms: Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, each pursuing its own interests and ambitions, sometimes in cooperation, but more often in competition with their Christian neighbors. This fragmentation reflected both the strength and the weakness of Reconquista ideology, powerful enough to sustain centuries of warfare, yet insufficiently precise to provide clear guidance for the organization of victory. The emergence of Castile as an independent county under Fernan González in the 10th century exemplified both the opportunities and the dangers of Christian division. The Castilian nobility, hardened by constant warfare along the frontier with Al-Andalus, developed a fierce pride in their military achievements and an equally fierce resistance to subordination to the royal authority of Leon. Their success in establishing an independent principality demonstrated that Christian expansion had created multiple centers of power, each capable of pursuing its own version of the Reconquista. The marriage politics that characterized relationships among the Christian kingdoms revealed the complex interplay between cooperation and competition that would define the medieval phase of the Reconquista. Royal marriages were simultaneously instruments of alliance and sources of dynastic conflict, creating claims and counterclaims that could unite kingdoms under single rulers or divide them through succession disputes. The personal union of Leon and Castile under Ferdinand I in 1037 created the most powerful Christian state in Iberia. Yet it also established precedents for future divisions that would complicate the coordination of anti-Islamic campaigns. The development of distinct national identities within the broader framework of Christian resistance foreshadowed the political complexity that would characterize the later phases of the Reconquista. Castilian pride in their role as frontline warriors, Aragonese emphasis on their Mediterranean commercial networks, Portuguese determination to maintain independence from their larger neighbors. These emerging identities would eventually prove as important as religious solidarity in shaping the final phases of the struggle against Islamic rule. The remarkable achievements of the expanding Christian kingdoms might suggest that Islamic Spain was in terminal decline throughout this period. Yet such a conclusion would fundamentally misunderstand the sophisticated and adaptive nature of Al-Andalus civilization. The Islamic response to Christian expansion revealed the resilience and creativity of a society that had lost territory, but retained much of its military, administrative, and cultural vitality. The great reforms of Abd al-Rahman III in the 10th century transformed the Emirate of Córdoba into the Caliphate of Córdoba, creating a powerful centralized state capable of coordinating effective resistance to Christian expansion. The military innovations developed by Islamic commanders during this period demonstrated their understanding that traditional strategies would need to be adapted to address the changing nature of Christian warfare. The development of professional armies supplemented by voluntary Ghazi warriors provided Al-Andalus with military forces that combined disciplined tactical expertise with religious motivation. The systematic fortification of frontier territories created defensive networks that channeled Christian attacks into predetermined killing zones where Islamic forces could fight on favorable terms. The military innovations developed by Islamic commanders during this period demonstrated their understanding that traditional strategies would need to be adapted to address the changing nature of Christian warfare. The development of professional armies supplemented by voluntary Ghazi warriors provided Al-Andalus with military forces that combined disciplined tactical expertise with religious motivation. The systematic fortification of frontier territories created defensive networks that channeled Christian attacks into predetermined killing zones where Islamic forces could fight on favorable terms. The cultural flowering of Islamic Spain during the 10th and 11th centuries, the Golden Age of Córdoba, the architectural marvels of the Great Mosque, the philosophical achievements of Averroes and Maimonides, revealed a civilization that remained confident in its ultimate superiority despite territorial losses to Christian forces. This cultural vitality provided Al-Andalus with soft power resources that complemented its military capabilities, attracting scholars and artists from across the Islamic world while projecting an image of sophistication that contrasted favorably with the rough frontier culture of the Christian kingdoms. Yet even the remarkable achievements of the Caliphate of Córdoba could not permanently reverse the fundamental dynamics that favored Christian expansion. The geographic advantages that had served the early Asturian resistance so well, defensible mountain territories, river valleys that facilitated communication and supply, proximity to European sources of military and financial support, continued to shape the strategic balance in favor of the northern kingdoms. More importantly, the demographic trends that favored Christian populations in the north gradually shifted the balance of military potential away from the Islamic south. The story of the Spanish Reconquista's first 4 centuries reveals a conflict of extraordinary complexity and consequence, one that transformed not merely the political map of Iberia, but the cultural and religious identity of an entire peninsula. From the desperate resistance of Pelagius in his mountain cave to the confident expansion of Ferdinand I across the Duero River, Christian Spain had evolved from a collection of refugee camps into a formidable military and political force capable of sustained territorial conquest. Yet the greatest challenges and the most decisive battles still lay ahead, as the fragmented Christian kingdoms would need to overcome their own divisions and face the unified power of the Almoravid and Almohad empires from North Africa. The transformation was remarkable, but it was far from complete. The true test of Christian Spain's destiny would come in the centuries ahead, when the competing claims of faith and power, unity and independence, pragmatic accommodation and religious zeal would be tested in the crucible of battles that would determine not merely the fate of Iberia, but the future course of European and world history. By the dawn of the 12th century, the Spanish Reconquista had reached a critical inflection point. The Christian kingdoms, strengthened by 4 centuries of expansion and consolidation, controlled nearly half of the Iberian Peninsula, yet their greatest trials lay ahead. The fragmented taifa kingdoms of Al-Andalus, weakened by internal division, would soon call upon the puritanical Almoravid warriors from Morocco, bringing new intensity to the ancient struggle between cross and crescent. The age of gradual expansion was ending. What followed would be an era of decisive battles, unified Christian purpose, and ultimately, the complete transformation of Iberia. The patient work of generations was about to be tested in the fires of total war, where the very survival of Christian Spain would hang in the balance before emerging triumphant in ways that would reshape the entire world. The news reached the fractured taifa kingdoms of Al-Andalus like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the Almoravid commander who had carved an empire from the Sahara to the Atlas Mountains, had answered their desperate plea for assistance against the advancing Christian armies. In the summer of 1086, as Alfonso VI of Leon Castile celebrated his recent conquest of Toledo, the ancient Visigothic capital and the psychological heart of Islamic Spain, black banners appeared on the southern horizon, heralding the arrival of an army unlike any that had crossed from Africa since the original conquest 4 centuries earlier. The Almoravids who disembarked at Algeciras represented a very different strain of Islamic civilization than the sophisticated, cosmopolitan culture that had flourished in Córdoba and Seville. These were desert warriors, hardened by decades of jihad against the pagan kingdoms of West Africa. Inspired by a puritanical interpretation of Islam that rejected the cultural compromises and philosophical sophistication of Andalusi society. They viewed the Taifa kings not as allies, but as corrupt rulers whose weakness had invited Christian aggression, and they regarded the very concept of convivencia, the peaceful coexistence of different religious communities, as a betrayal of divine commandments. Yusuf ibn Tashfin himself embodied the austere magnificence of this new Islamic force. The chronicles describe him as a man of medium height but commanding presence, his dark skin bearing the ritual scars of Saharan nobility, his simple robes contrasting dramatically with the silk and gold that adorned the Andalusi princes who had summoned him. He spoke little and acted decisively, bringing to the Iberian struggle a clarity of purpose that had been absent since the days of the original conquest. For him, the conflict was not about territorial control or dynastic succession, but about the fundamental question of whether the Iberian Peninsula would remain within the Dar al-Islam or fall permanently to the enemies of the faith. The impact of the Almoravid intervention became immediately apparent at the Battle of Sagrajas on October 23, 1086. Alfonso VI, confident in his recent successes and perhaps contemptuous of what he assumed would be another collection of disunited Islamic forces, advanced southward with an army that represented the flower of Christian Spanish chivalry. the collision between these two military systems. The heavy cavalry and fortified tactics of the Christian north against the swift horsemen and disciplined infantry of the Saharan south produced a battlefield encounter of unprecedented ferocity and consequence. The dawn mist that shrouded the plains near Badajoz on that October morning in 1086 concealed more than two armies preparing for battle. It obscured a confrontation between two fundamentally different visions of Spain's future. Alfonso VI, who had styled himself Emperor of all Spain, following his conquest of Toledo, led a coalition that represented 4 centuries of Christian expansion and consolidation. His forces included the heavy cavalry of Leon and Castile, the mountain fighters of Asturias and Galicia, the Basque warriors of Navarre, and even contingents of Mozarabic Christians who had fled Islamic territories. This was the culmination of the Reconquista's first phase, a united Christian front finally capable of challenging Islamic dominance across the entire peninsula. Against this imposing array, Yusuf ibn Tashfin deployed the military machine that had conquered an empire stretching from the Niger River to the Mediterranean. The core of his army consisted of the Almoravid Guard, Sanhaja Berbers whose loyalty had been forged in decades of desert warfare and religious instruction. These were supplemented by contingents from the various tribes that had submitted to Almoravid authority, each bringing distinctive military traditions adapted to their particular environments. Most significantly, the Almoravid army included large numbers of African infantry armed with javelins and long spears, fighters whose disciplined formations and coordinated tactics offered a stark contrast to the individualistic combat style that characterized much of medieval warfare. The battle itself unfolded with a complexity that revealed the sophistication of both military systems. Alfonso VI, following conventional European practice, deployed his heavy cavalry in the center with infantry support on the flanks, expecting to break the Islamic line through a concentrated charge led by his royal guard. The initial Christian assault achieved considerable success, driving back the Andalusi troops who formed the front rank of the Islamic army and threatening to reach Yusuf's command position. For a moment, it appeared that Christian military superiority would prove decisive, that the Almoravid intervention would end in disaster, that the path toward complete Christian victory lay open. Yet Yusuf ibn Tashfin had not conquered half of North Africa through conventional tactics. As the Christian cavalry became disordered in pursuit of the apparently retreating Andalusi forces, he unleashed the reserve formations that he had concealed behind low hills flanking the battlefield. Thousands of Almoravid horsemen struck both Christian flanks simultaneously, while the reformed Andalusi infantry counterattacked in the center. The tactical sophistication of this maneuver, coordinating multiple formations across a battlefield several miles wide using only visual signals and battlefield drums, demonstrated that the Almoravids possessed military capabilities that matched or exceeded anything the Christian kingdoms could deploy. The collapse of the Christian army at Sagrajas was swift and catastrophic. Alfonso VI himself barely escaped capture, fleeing northward with the remnants of his guard, while thousands of Christian knights lay dead or wounded on the field. The psychological impact of this defeat extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. For the first time in over a century, a major Christian army had been not merely defeated but annihilated, its survivors scattered across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. the myth of Christian invincibility, carefully cultivated through generations of successful expansion, lay shattered among the corpses of the finest knights of Leon and Castile. The years following Sagrajas witnessed a fundamental transformation in the character of Islamic resistance to Christian expansion. The Almoravids, having demonstrated their military superiority, moved quickly to consolidate their control over Al-Andalus, deposing the taifa kings whose weakness had invited their intervention and establishing direct rule from their capital at Marrakesh. This political centralization, combined with their military capabilities and religious fervor, created the most formidable Islamic state that Spain had seen since the original Umayyad Caliphate. The Almoravid approach to governance in Al-Andalus reflected their desert origins and puritanical religious convictions. The sophisticated court culture of Córdoba and Seville, with its traditions of philosophical inquiry, poetic innovation, and religious tolerance, gave way to a more austere and militaristic administration focused primarily on the requirements of holy war against the Christian kingdoms. The great libraries were purged of works deemed incompatible with Orthodox Islam. The philosophical schools that had made Andalusi cities centers of learning were disbanded, and the Christian and Jewish communities that had flourished under the Taifa kingdoms found themselves subject to increasingly restrictive regulations. Yet this cultural retrenchment was accompanied by military innovations that made the Almoravid state extraordinarily effective at prosecuting warfare against Christian opponents. The tribal military system that had conquered North Africa was adapted to Iberian conditions, creating professional armies that combined the mobility and striking power of nomadic cavalry with the disciplined infantry formations needed for siege warfare. The systematic fortification of frontier positions, the development of supplying networks capable of supporting prolonged campaigns, and the integration of naval power from bases in North Africa created a military machine that could challenge Christian expansion across multiple theaters simultaneously. The Christian response to the Almoravid threat revealed both the strengths and the limitations of the kingdoms that had emerged from 4 centuries of Reconquista warfare. The immediate reaction was predictable. Desperate appeals for assistance from other European powers, frantic efforts to rebuild the armies shattered at Sagrajas, and the inevitable recriminations among Christian leaders about responsibility for the disaster. Yet beneath this surface panic, more fundamental adaptations were taking place that would ultimately prove decisive in the renewed struggle against Islamic power. The existential threat posed by Almoravid military superiority accomplished what centuries of papal exhortation and royal diplomacy had failed to achieve: the gradual unification of Christian Spanish efforts under effective central leadership. Alfonso VI, chastened by his defeat at Sagrajas, but not broken by it, initiated a series of military and administrative reforms that transformed the Christian response to Islamic power. The creation of military orders, the Order of Santiago, the Order of Calatrava, the Order of Alcántara, provided the Christian kingdoms with professional warriors whose training, equipment, and dedication matched those of their Almoravid opponents. These military orders represented a revolutionary innovation in medieval warfare, combining the monastic discipline of religious communities with the military expertise of professional soldiers. The knights who joined these organizations took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet they were also trained in the most advanced military techniques of their age, and equipped with the finest weapons and armor that Christian resources could provide. Their establishment of fortified commanderies throughout the frontier regions created a network of strongholds that could coordinate defensive operations while serving as bases for offensive campaigns into Islamic territory. The success of the military orders in adapting to the Almoravid challenge was demonstrated most dramatically in the defense of the strategic fortress of Calatrava in 1147. When Alfonso VII of Leon Castile found himself unable to maintain adequate garrisons in this crucial position, he offered it to the newly formed Order of Calatrava, whose knights accepted the responsibility despite being vastly outnumbered by the Islamic forces threatening the position. Their successful defense of Calatrava against repeated Almoravid assaults established the military orders as the most effective Christian institution for prosecuting frontier warfare. The broader implications of this military innovation extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. The military orders created institutional frameworks that could preserve and transmit military knowledge across generations, ensuring that the lessons learned in combat against Islamic forces would not be lost when individual commanders died or retired. They provided the Christian kingdoms with reliable military forces whose loyalty transcended local political divisions, creating the possibility for coordinated strategic planning that had been impossible during the earlier phases of the Reconquista. The transformation of Christian military capabilities during the 12th century coincided with internal developments within the Almoravid Empire that gradually undermined its effectiveness as a fighting force. The very success that had enabled the Almoravids to control territories from the Senegal River to the Ebro had created administrative and logistical challenges that strained their desert-based military system. The need to garrison fortifications across such vast distances, to maintain supply lines spanning thousands of miles, and to coordinate military operations across multiple theaters simultaneously exceeded the capabilities of their tribal organizational structures. More fundamentally, the Almoravid Empire faced the same challenge that had confronted every nomadic conquering group throughout history: the gradual corruption of military effectiveness through exposure to settled civilization. The warriors who had emerged from the Sahara as instruments of religious purification found themselves increasingly absorbed in the pleasures and complexities of urban life in Al-Andalus and North Africa. Their sons, raised in palaces rather than desert camps, lacked the austere discipline that had made their fathers invincible, while their military techniques became increasingly outdated as Christian opponents adapted to counter their traditional advantages. The emergence of the Almohad movement in the Atlas Mountains during the 1120s provided a striking demonstration of this process of military decay. The Almohads, led by the charismatic Ibn Tumurt and his successor Abd al-Mumin, represented yet another wave of puritanical reform from the North African periphery, condemning the Almoravids for the same compromises and corruptions that the Almoravids had once condemned in the Taifa kings. The civil wars that resulted from this challenge divided Islamic forces at precisely the moment when Christian military capabilities were reaching unprecedented levels of effectiveness. The Battle of Arique in 1139 marked the symbolic turning point in the long struggle between Christian and Islamic forces on the Iberian Peninsula. When Afonso Henriques of Portugal, the bastard son of a minor count, defeated a much larger Almoravid army and proclaimed himself king of an independent Portuguese realm. He demonstrated that Christian forces had recovered from the disasters of the late 11th century and were once again capable of achieving decisive victories against their Islamic opponents. The psychological impact of Intrigue extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, providing inspiration for Christian populations throughout Iberia and attracting support from across Europe. The middle decades of the 12th century witnessed a remarkable convergence of factors that would prove decisive in determining the ultimate outcome of the Reconquista. The arrival of the Second Crusade in 1147, though focused primarily on the Holy Land, provided European support for Christian expansion in Iberia through the simultaneous campaigns that captured Lisbon for the Portuguese and Almeria for the Castilians. These victories demonstrated that the Spanish Reconquista was increasingly viewed by European opinion as an integral part of the broader struggle between Christianity and Islam, deserving of the same support and recognition accorded to campaigns in Palestine and Syria. The Almohad conquest of Al-Andalus in the 1150s initially appeared to reverse these Christian gains by replacing the weakened Almoravids with another wave of North African reformers whose military capabilities and religious fervor matched those of their predecessors. Abd al-Mumin, the Almohad Caliph who completed the conquest of Almoravid territories, brought to Iberia armies that had been hardened in decades of warfare across the Maghreb, and inspired by a theological movement that claimed direct revelation from God. The early Almohad victories, particularly their recapture of Almeria in 1157, suggested that the pattern of Islamic revival from North Africa would continue indefinitely. Yet the Almohad ascendancy coincided with developments in Christian Spain that would prove even more significant than the military innovations of the previous century. The personal union of Leon and Castile under Alfonso VIII in 1158 created the largest and most powerful Christian state in Iberia, while the simultaneous expansion of the Crown of Aragon under Alfonso II extended Christian control throughout the eastern regions of the peninsula. More importantly, these territorial consolidations were accompanied by demographic and economic changes that fundamentally altered the balance of resources available to Christian and Islamic forces. The systematic colonization of conquered territories, which had been developing since the early phases of the Reconquista, reached unprecedented scales during the 12th century. The establishment of fueros, local charters that provided favorable terms for settlers, attracted thousands of Christian families from northern Spain and southern France to newly conquered territories. These settlers provided not only agricultural labor that made Christian expansion economically sustainable, but also military reserves that could be mobilized for defensive operations. The result was a gradual but decisive shift in the demographic balance that favored Christian populations in an increasing proportion of Iberian territory. The 13th century opened with both Christian and Islamic forces preparing for what all participants recognized would be a climactic struggle for control of the Iberian Peninsula. The Almohad Caliph Muhammad al-Nasir, who had inherited the most powerful Islamic empire since the original Umayyad Caliphate, assembled in Morocco an army that contemporary chroniclers numbered at over 100,000 men, drawn from tribes across North and West Africa and reinforced by the remaining Islamic populations of Al-Andalus. This was to be the final, overwhelming offensive that would drive the Christian kingdoms back into the Asturian mountains and restore Islamic dominance over the entire peninsula. Against this formidable array, Pope Innocent III proclaimed a formal crusade that attracted support from across Christian Europe, while the Spanish kingdoms achieved an unprecedented degree of unity under the leadership of Alfonso VIII of Castile. The army that assembled at Toledo in the spring of 1212 represented not merely the military resources of the Iberian Christian kingdoms, but the convergence of European crusading enthusiasm with Spanish territorial ambitions. French knights rode alongside Castilian hidalgos, Italian crossbowmen fought beside Aragonese infantry, and Portuguese cavalry charged with Leonese men-at-arms in a coalition that embodied the pan-European character that the Reconquista had finally achieved. The campaign that culminated in the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa on July 16, 1212, was fought with an intensity and scale that dwarfed all previous encounters between Christian and Islamic forces in Iberia. The Almohad strategy, based on the successful model of earlier North African interventions, sought to achieve a decisive victory through superior numbers and the psychological impact of facing warriors who claimed divine sanction for their cause. Muhammad al-Nasir positioned his forces in the mountain passes south of Toledo, expecting to repeat the tactical success that had made Sagrajas such a disaster for Christian arms. Yet the Christian army that approached Las Navas de Tolosa bore little resemblance to the feudal levies that had been destroyed at Sagrajas over a century earlier. The military orders provided disciplined heavy cavalry trained specifically for combat against Islamic opponents, while the urban militias of the expanding Christian cities contributed infantry formations equipped with the latest developments in armor and weaponry. Most importantly, the unified command structure that had been achieved through decades of diplomatic and dynastic maneuvering ensured that Christian forces could coordinate their operations with unprecedented effectiveness. The battle itself unfolded with a drama and consequence that would resonate through the remainder of Spanish history. The initial Almohad assault, delivered by waves of African cavalry and infantry, achieved considerable success against the Christian flanks, threatening to envelop the entire Christian army in a repetition of earlier Islamic victories. For hours, the outcome remained in doubt as individual Christian formations held their ground against overwhelming odds, while their commanders attempted to organize a coordinated response to the Almohad offensive. The decisive moment came when Alfonso VIII, observing that the Almohad attack had committed all available reserves, ordered a general advance by the Christian center directly toward Muhammad al-Nasir's command position. The charge that followed, led by the military orders and supported by the concentrated archery of European crossbowmen, shattered the Almohad defensive line and created panic throughout the Islamic army. The psychological impact of seeing their caliph's banner in retreat proved catastrophic for Almohad morale, transforming what had been an orderly battle into a rout that extended across hundreds of miles of Andalusi territory. The aftermath of Las Navas de Tolosa revealed the extent to which Islamic power in Iberia had depended upon the military capabilities and political unity imposed by successive waves of North African intervention. With the Almohad army destroyed and Muhammad al-Nasir dead, the remaining Islamic territories fragmented into the familiar pattern of competing taifa kingdoms, each too weak to resist Christian expansion, yet unable to coordinate effective resistance with their neighbors. The speed with which Christian forces exploited their victory demonstrated how thoroughly the demographic and military balance had shifted in their favor. The systematic conquest of Andalusi cities during the decades following Los Navas de Tolosa proceeded with a methodical efficiency that contrasted sharply with the sporadic advances of earlier centuries. Córdoba, the ancient capital of Islamic Spain and the seat of the Umayyad Caliphate, fell to Ferdinand III of Castile in 1236 after a siege that lasted barely 16 months. Seville, the greatest commercial center of Al-Andalus and the jewel of Almohad architecture, surrendered in 1248 when its population could no longer endure the systematic destruction of its agricultural hinterland by Christian raiding parties. The conquest of these great cities was accompanied by demographic transformations that ensured the permanence of Christian control. Unlike the earlier phases of the Reconquista, when Christian forces had been content to extract tribute from conquered Islamic populations, the 13th century advances involved systematic colonization programs that replaced Islamic inhabitants with Christian settlers from northern Spain and southern France. The Great Mosque of Córdoba was converted into a cathedral, its magnificent mihrab sealed, and its qibla reoriented toward Christian purposes, while the Islamic libraries that had preserved classical learning for centuries were either destroyed or dispersed to Christian monasteries. Yet the completion of Christian conquest in most of Iberia did not result in the simple elimination of Islamic civilization from the peninsula. The Kingdom of Granada, established by Muhammad ibn Nasr in 1238, created a tributary Islamic state that would survive for another 2.5 centuries under Christian protection. This arrangement, formalized through treaties that guaranteed Granada's internal autonomy in exchange for tribute payments and military support, demonstrated the pragmatic accommodation that had always characterized the most successful phases of the Reconquista. While Castile and Leon pursued the systematic conquest of central and western Al-Andalus, the Crown of Aragon developed a different approach to expansion that would prove equally significant for the ultimate completion of the Reconquista. The marriage of Petronilla of Aragon to Ramon Berenguer IV of Barcelona in 1137 had created a composite monarchy that combined the military resources of the Aragonese highlands with the commercial networks of Catalonian merchants, producing a Mediterranean power capable of pursuing expansion beyond the Iberian Peninsula. The Aragonese conquest of the Balearic Islands between 1229 and 1235, led by James I the Conqueror, demonstrated the naval capabilities that distinguished the Eastern Christian kingdoms from their Castilian neighbors. These campaigns, supported by Genoese and Pisan fleets, eliminated the last Islamic strongholds in the Western Mediterranean, while establishing Aragonese control over the crucial sea routes that connected Al-Andalus with North Africa. The strategic implications of this maritime dominance became apparent during the later phases of the Reconquista, when Islamic forces found themselves increasingly isolated from their traditional sources of reinforcement and supply. The systematic colonization of conquered territories that characterized Aragonese expansion revealed alternative models for the integration of diverse populations within Christian political structures. The Furs of Valencia, promulgated by James I following his conquest of that kingdom between 1232 and 1245, established legal frameworks that preserved many aspects of Islamic law and custom while asserting Christian political supremacy. This approach, though controversial among some Christian clerics, proved highly effective at maintaining social stability and economic productivity in newly conquered territories. The success of the Aragonese model influenced developments throughout Christian Spain, providing examples of how conquest could be achieved without the massive demographic disruptions that had characterized earlier phases of the Reconquista. The preservation of Islamic agricultural techniques, commercial networks, and artisanal traditions within Christian political frameworks demonstrated that the completion of territorial conquest did not require the elimination of all aspects of Islamic civilization. The marriage of Isabella I of Castile to Ferdinand II of Aragon in 1469 represented the culmination of centuries of gradual convergence between the major Christian kingdoms of Iberia. This dynastic union, achieved through secret negotiations that defied the opposition of powerful noble factions in both kingdoms, created the political framework within which the final phase of the Reconquista would be completed. Yet the significance of this marriage extended far beyond its immediate implications for the conquest of Granada, establishing the foundation for Spanish unity and global expansion that would reshape the history of the entire world. The Catholic monarchs, as Isabella and Ferdinand came to be known, brought to their joint rule complementary strengths that proved ideally suited to the challenges of completing the Reconquista, while establishing the administrative and military capabilities necessary for global empire. Isabella's Castile provided the demographic resources, territorial base, and crusading ideology that had sustained Christian expansion for centuries, while Ferdinand's Aragon contributed the naval power, commercial expertise, and diplomatic experience that would prove essential for projecting Spanish influence beyond the Iberian Peninsula. The decade-long campaign against the Kingdom of Granada between 1482 and 1492 that marked the final phase of the Reconquista demonstrated the sophisticated military and administrative capabilities that the unified Spanish monarchy could deploy. The systematic reduction of Granada's fortress cities through prolonged siege warfare, supported by artillery that represented the latest developments in military technology, revealed how completely Christian forces had mastered the arts of conquest that had been developing for 8 centuries. The siege of Granada itself, which began in April 1491 and ended with the surrender of Boabdil on January 2, 1492, was conducted with a ceremonial magnificence that emphasized the historical significance of Christian victory. The 10th city of Santa Fe, constructed by Christian forces outside Granada's walls, was laid out as a permanent settlement that demonstrated the Catholic monarch's determination to complete the conquest regardless of the time required. When Boabdil finally emerged from the Alhambra to surrender the keys of the last Islamic stronghold in Iberia, he was participating in a ritual that concluded 8 centuries of warfare and established the foundation for centuries of Spanish global dominance. The completion of the Reconquista in 1492 marked not merely the end of Islamic political authority in Iberia, but the beginning of a new phase in world history that would carry Spanish influence to the Americas, the Philippines, and beyond. The expulsion of the Jews in 1492, the systematic persecution of Mudéjars, Muslims living under Christian rule, and the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition revealed the darker aspects of Christian victory, demonstrating that the completion of territorial conquest was accompanied by religious intolerance that contradicted the pragmatic accommodation that had characterized much of the medieval Reconquista. Yet the positive achievements of the 8th century struggle remained extraordinary by any historical standard. The Christian kingdoms that had emerged from Pelayo's desperate resistance in the caves of Covadonga had not merely survived, but had created a unified Spanish monarchy capable of projecting power across the globe. The military innovations developed during centuries of frontier warfare, the integration of heavy cavalry with disciplined infantry, the systematic use of artillery in siege operations, the coordination of land and naval forces in combined operations, provided Spain with military capabilities that would prove decisive in the conquest of the Americas. The cultural synthesis that emerged from 8 centuries of warfare, accommodation, and conquest created a distinctly Spanish civilization that combined Christian religious fervor with Islamic architectural influences, European political institutions with North African military traditions, and medieval social structures with Renaissance intellectual achievements. The Spain that emerged from the Reconquista was not simply a Christian kingdom that had defeated Islamic opponents, but a unique synthesis of diverse cultural traditions forged in the crucible of prolonged warfare. The global implications of Spanish unity and expansion extended far beyond the immediate consequences of completing the Reconquista. The conquest of the Americas, beginning with Columbus's voyage in 1492, was made possible by the maritime expertise, military capabilities, and administrative experience that had been developed during the final phases of the struggle against Granada. The silver of Potosi, the trade routes of the Pacific, and the evangelical missions that carried Christianity to the Philippines and beyond all represented the global projection of energies that had been focused for 8 centuries on the relatively narrow theater of Iberian conquest. The Spanish Reconquista stands as one of the longest and most consequential military campaigns in human history, a struggle that transformed not merely the political map of Europe, but the cultural and religious identity of an entire civilization. From the desperate resistance of Visigothic refugees in the mountains of Asturias to the triumphant entry of the Catholic monarchs into the Alhambra, the reconquest of Spain revealed the extraordinary persistence of human ambition, guided by religious conviction and shaped by the practical requirements of territorial conquest. The legacy of the Reconquista extended far beyond the boundaries of the Iberian Peninsula, providing the ideological framework and institutional capabilities that enabled Spanish expansion across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The conquistadors who toppled the Aztec and Inca empires, the missionaries who established Christianity in the Philippines and California, the administrators who governed territories from Mexico to Argentina, all were heirs to traditions of warfare, colonization, and cultural synthesis that had been perfected during 8 centuries of struggle against Islamic power in Spain. Yet perhaps the most significant achievement of the Reconquista was its demonstration that sustained human effort, guided by clear objectives and supported by effective institutions, could achieve transformations that seemed impossible when viewed from the perspective of any single generation. The Christian refugees who followed Pelayo into the mountains of Asturias could not have imagined that their descendants would rule territories that spanned the globe. Yet the patient accumulation of military capabilities, political authority, and cultural confidence across centuries of warfare made such achievements not merely possible, but inevitable. The completion of the Spanish Reconquista in 1492 marked the end of one of history's great adventures, and the beginning of another even greater. The cross that had been planted in the mountains of Asturias in 718 would be carried to the shores of the Pacific before the 16th century ended, fulfilling in ways that no medieval chronicler could have anticipated the promise implicit in Pelayo's defiant stand at Covadonga. The 8th century struggle for Spain had forged not merely a nation, but an empire, not merely a kingdom, but a civilization whose influence would reshape the history of the entire world. Subscribe and welcome to the Empire.